George and Helen Papashvili, authors of Anything Can Happen, meet John K.M. McCaffrey, Louis Gannett, and Bennett Cerf in The Author Meets the Critics. And as chairman, here's the fiction editor of the American magazine, John K.M. McCaffrey.
Anything Can Happen is the title of a new book by George and Helen Papashvili, and it is an appropriate title, too, for The Author Meets the Critics. On these programs, the author, or as on this occasion, the co-authors of a bestseller, face three critics. There's no preparation. We ask for no commitments in advance, so that anything can, and usually does, happen. For this session, the brickbats, or perhaps they'll turn out to be bouquets, will be tossed to George and Helen Papashvili by my colleagues in the Critics' Corner. Louis Gannett, literary editor of the New York Herald Tribune, who has just returned from an assignment as foreign correspondent on the European fighting front, and Bennett Cerf, the non-stop columnist, publisher, and author of the new bestseller, Try and Stop Me.
Before the critics begin, Mr. McCaffrey, I'd like to tell our listeners about the book prizes we're offering. Every member of the radio audience can sit as a judge in this literary tug-of-war between the author and the critics. At the close of this program, after you've heard both sides, we are going to ask what's your decision on Anything Can Happen by George and Helen Papashvili. Do you or do you not intend to read it? The Author Meets the Critics is presented in the hope that it will help you make a choice, whatever that choice may be, favorable or unfavorable. And through the courtesy of the Book of the Month Club, we're able to award 3 unusual book prizes for the best comments from listeners. I'll have more details for you later, but first, here's Mr. McCaffrey.
We have a simple set of rules here, Mr. and Mrs. Papashvili. We're informal, and in view of that informality, we're just going to call you George and Helen. Somebody's going to trip sooner or later. And we're thoroughly democratic, except that is in one respect. We critics, Mr. Gannett, Mr. Cerf, and I, claim the floor for ourselves first, while you authors remain silent on the sidelines. After a while, though, there'll be a signal, and then it's your turn. This book is a book about George and Helen, mostly about George. Helen comes in at the end, as I am told a wife should. It's the story of a gentleman from Georgia who arrives in the United States with a very small knowledge of our language, habits and customs, but with bright dreams of America, and the adventures which he has here during his stay of some 20-odd years, mostly the highlights, I should say. I might say also that bright dream of America is not at all dimmed in the book. As a matter of fact, I would say that it gains in luster as the book goes along. But perhaps we'd better have an expression of opinion from our critics. Mr. Gannett.
Well, I don't know as it's all such bright luster. They've got a lot of funny things to say about America. First thing, when George got here, he met a sharper who swapped his lambskin hat for a cap. That was a dirty deal. And then he had to get in court and get himself arrested a little, and he met a fixer, and that was a little tough. The judge was all right, and then he met a scab herder, and then he got sold down the river by a real estate faker. And when he got all through that, he began discovering about Americans. He said we were stingy. I don't think he knew anything about how stingy we are. He says we just have 2 people, 2 steaks. Where did he get the idea we get 2 steaks anyhow?
This was in 1923. Bennett?
I think that despite the fact that Mr. Papashvili had all these troubles that Mr. Gannett talks about, there comes through the pages of this book such a keen and heartwarming love of America that you close the book feeling, at least I did, that people who come from somewhere other than the American nation itself, immigrants who come here, are frequently more aware of the blessings of America than we people here are ourselves. This book, more than anything I've read in years, pointed up to me how beautiful America can be to people who come from a foreign country. Now, Mr. Papashvili, who comes from Georgia, a country that I was fortunate enough to see once, has come farther than most of the people that I know. And I was struck by the Papashvili in his name because I remembered that Joe Stalin's name is Jugashvili, if I'm correct. Am I not? That is the right name, isn't it, George?
You are, right.
And I think the Jugashvili, I think the Vili means son of. I hope it does. If not, I'm sticking my neck way out.
No, it does. It means son of.
In spite of the fact that it's a wonderful book, I have a couple of criticisms that if it's an order to give now, John, I'd like
Yes,
to...
I just want you to remember, Bennett, before you criticize too extensively, that Mr. Papashvili, or George as we're calling him, came here as a sword maker. Just bear that in mind, that's all. Now go ahead.
These criticisms are very, very mild ones, and besides, I searched him when he came in. He has no sword with him. The first criticism that I would make of Anything Can Happen is that occasionally, it seems to me, it's done with a phony accent. I found several portions of the book written in the type of broken English that George might be expected to use. But then, on several other pages, I found passages of perfectly beautiful, clear-cut, literate English, which would be the sort that Mrs. Papashvili, who is American and owns a bookstore, might be inclined to use. I was bothered by this jumping back and forth between the Georgian and the pure American.
Of course, I suspect, Bennett, that they just put something over us. I think Helen wrote the whole book, and she kind of makes out this is George's accent. And there are a lot of things I doubt about that book, you know.
Well, if she did make out it was George's accent, and she says pretty clearly that she did write the book, I don't complain about that, but I think she should have stuck to it more resolutely and dauntlessly than she did.
Well, I don't think that we can blame her particularly for putting her accent on George. After all, that's a wifely thing to do, too. But what are these things that you don't believe, Mr. Gannett? You've come back from the wars in a very cynical mood.
Well, I'll tell you one thing I don't believe from the way we're talking here. I don't believe in his picture of America. He says it's a place where everybody laughs all the time and laughs at himself. And I think we're being awfully serious here. Don't you, John?
Well, I think we are, but I think that this book covers many, many years. For instance, a lot of it which isn't making my point very well during the Depression in Detroit. But I think, too, that we're seeing this world of America through George's eyes, and certainly there are rose tints there.
Well, there are rose tints. There's that phrase, my bag of gold, it is America. And America unrolling like a carpet from heaven's best weaving. They're pretty nice phrases. I hope we can live up to them some. What do you think, Bennett?
I loved every part of the book. I am one of the great enthusiasts for this book and have been since long before it came out, and I read the galleys. I did feel then, and I would like to say now, before our time is up, that I think the book ends much too abruptly. John, you mentioned the fact that Helen comes in at the end. Well, she comes in far too near the end for me. I felt that the book was carefully and lovingly done up to a certain point, and then it seemed to me the Papashvili suddenly heard that the Book of the Month Club had taken it, and it had to be finished in about 2.5 hours.
Well, Bennett, you know that recipe they give there if you want to be happy married. This is what I think Helen wrote. She said, at least once a day, say to your husband, I love you. Well, now, I don't know about that being a recipe. I think the recipe for being happy and married is say once a day, oh, dear, the Book of the Month Club took our book.
I think that perhaps you're thinking of another book. That was a book by Ludwig Bemelmans called I Love You, I Love You, I Love You, wasn't it? I think that Mr. Cerf has indicated a very important point about this book. During the last part of the century and the early part of this century, we had quite a few books by immigrants on their experiences here and upon the great effect that America had upon them in this great American country, such things as the melting pot. And this is the first time one of those things has come along in some time. And from talk in Congress and in the newspapers, we realized that this is going to be an important subject after the war, where the whole immigration problem is going to be very serious. I hope we can maintain as equable an attitude toward it as the Papashvilis do. But about this business of not believing things, Mr. Gannett, is there any incident in the book that you didn't believe?
Oh, there's several of them. What I really want to know is how much of it's Helen and how much of it's George, and I'm just looking forward to the next 15 minutes in the hope of finding out.
Well, I'm sure you will.
I just don't believe that a man born to make swords in Georgia, in the Russian Caucasus, and a girl who I think grew up in Pennsylvania, though I may be wrong, are just identically the same thing. I think it's pretty
I'm sorry. There's the signal, and time's up for the critics. Now it's our author's turn. But before we introduce George and Helen Papashvili, a word to our listeners about our book prices. Every member of the radio audience is invited to sit as a judge on the author meets the critics. After hearing both sides, the author and the critics, what do you think of Anything Can Happen? Do you or do you not intend to read it? If you do, tell us why. If not, why not? The author meets the critics' hopes in presenting this program that it has helped you make up your mind about George and Helen Papashvili's new book. And we'd like to know your decision. So send us your comments, favorable or unfavorable, on Anything Can Happen. And for the 3 best letters or postcards, the Book of the Month Club will award really unusual book prizes. At the close of the program, we'll have further details for you about them. But now, we know you're anxious to hear from our authors, so without further ado, here are George and Helen Papashvili.
Well, it's rather hard to know who to answer first, but I think I'll speak first to Mr. Cerf about the phony accent. Of course, when you write a book where you're writing down the words of someone who doesn't speak English very well, there are a number of things that you can do. You could take it down as though it was spoken into a dictaphone exactly, and that makes for rather hard reading. And as a matter of fact, I was about halfway through with the book when all of a sudden I said to myself, good heavens, I'm writing a dialect book. And if there's anything that I wouldn't read, it's a dialect book. So I tried to give the flavor and the sound and the position of words of my husband's language and the way he speaks, rather than to take it down exactly. In other words, I tried to find the rhythm of his speech and the juxtaposition of words in the sentence, the way he places them, and some of his transpositions of words, and use those to indicate the way he speaks. The second point that he raised about...
Well, now, let's hear Mr. Papashvili speak. I realize that it's very difficult to arrange that when his wife is right there, but Mr. Papashvili, how is your accent?
Well, I guess let somebody else judge about that. I don't know. I was thinking about Mr. Gannon's thinking that how is it everything is rosy and so on, how I find so wonderful. But I was just thinking now, when I came in here from Constantinople and probably about 2 years was living on the olives, naturally everything was beautiful and rosy, and I still think everything is beautiful and rosy. I didn't change my mind
Well,
yet.
now, George, you didn't think everything was beautiful and rosy in this country. I resented that when you talked about that American sickness. You remember that American sickness, the nervous broke down? The nervous broke down when your brain ain't interested in you anymore?
Well, I think
That isn't rosy.
I think he meant comparatively. If you had starved on black olives in Constantinople for 2 years, the things that you found here would be rather rosy. But the second point I wanted to make about the places where you felt that the language was too clear, I think if you ever are so inclined to reread the book, you will see there that when I used straight English, it was one of 2 times, either when he was thinking to himself, and I wanted to indicate that because, of course, people always think in good grammar, think well grammatically, or secondly, when it was a translation of him speaking in Georgian. And perhaps I should have pointed that up a little bit clearer, but I thought it would be obvious. In other words, when he's actually speaking in a conversation, I tried to take down his voice as it comes, but when he's thinking to himself or philosophizing, or when he's speaking in Georgian, then I tried to make it grammatically correct.
How do you find that answer, Bennett?
As a publisher listening to a bookseller, I accept it.
Bennett is in a state of pique, I might say, tonight, because the Papashvilis are becoming an important competitor to try and stop me on the bestseller list. He made that point earlier.
The other criticism that the book ends too abruptly is perhaps well taken. Unfortunately, it is my business to sell books. I have a bookshop, and I've sold books for almost 20 years. And in that 20 years, I would say that most books don't end abruptly enough. They just go on and on and on.
That seems to be by far the most popular statement of the evening, Helen. George, there was something that did bother me a little. That was the incident during your cross-country trek. George with a truck and a car took a large Russian family from Detroit to California.
By way of Youngstown,
By way of Youngstown, Ohio, that's right. Now, during this trip, many, many things happened, which we haven't got time to tell about here, but at one point in this hegira, they came to a river, and George and the truck started out to cross the river, and of course, in the middle of the river, the wheels began to sink lower and lower, and there was danger of losing all the household possessions, the bird cage, the 50 pounds of feathers that were going to be Luba's trousseau, and all the rest of it. So, of course, I can see his rosy luster because at this minute, out of the west, came galloping a band of Navajo Indians. And the Navajo Indians tied ropes to the truck, and they rescued George Papashvili. Well, this is in about 1934, George. Is this a purely literary experience, or did this happen?
It did happen, and I can prove it. If anybody wants to walk with me up to a Colorado River, that was in the Colorado River.
And
John,
they were on
I
horseback?
got rescued by a Navajo Indian out in the desert in 1933, and that was a year before George.
But did he come up riding on a horse?
Well,
No, they left horses on a bank. They come, I walk to them first and they ask them if they can give me a hand. And they can't understand what I was saying, and so I make them understand by my motion, and they understand better when they pull the truck out. I can understand them very well, they did too.
This happened much earlier than that. I think it really happened about 1929, didn't it, dear?
Oh, you mean there's something wrong in the book? No,
No, I think you've misread it, and they really came up driving sheep, which is what Navajos do.
I think all that
Excuse me. I'm sorry.
John, my Navajo came up driving a Buick, a Colorado Buick.
I think all that's thoroughly legitimate, and I think you're going to see it make a magnificent Technicolor production.
With a Navajo rug
with
as
a
the
Navajo-
centerpiece.
This book, before we go any further, I think we should, I'd like to make the point that anything can happen is, to me, very much in the line of the new type of humor that is going to sweep America. I think in the popularity of this book, you see one more sign of the moving away from the wisecrack insult school of humor to the softer, more nostalgic type of humor that is typified by plays like The Late George Apley or I Remember Mama. I think Anything Can Happen is a Georgian edition of I Remember Mama, and will be a magnificent play on the stage and then a great movie. And to question a few of the facts too closely, I think, is silly. If they're funny, they are legitimate.
Well, if the humor of insult goes out of fashion, Mr. Cerf, what will happen to this program?
It may get more pleasant.
Well, there are a couple of other questions, criticisms that I'd still like to answer. Mr. Gannett said that he wondered who wrote the book. Well, of course, I actually wrote the book, since my husband doesn't read and write. But of course, I couldn't have lived through those stories. He is the one who experienced them, who lived through them, and who told them to me. And I might tell you a very little bit about the way they come into being. You see, Georgians have large parties, and they all sit around the table, and they have wonderful time, and they eat, and they drink, and they tell stories. And sometimes these stories are old folk stories, and sometimes they're modern folk stories, like going across the continent in a broken-down car, meeting the Indians. And they tell them and they retell them until they take on the quality of little modern folk stories. And I heard lots of these. There are lots of them, of course, that we didn't put in the book. I tried to find stories that particularly illustrated a person coming to America and meeting certain problems here. And I just took those down and selected the ones that I thought were the most interesting.
Well, just a minute, Helen. You said that George didn't read or write. Now, he wrote something down on that pad there. I can see it from
here.
here.
If you can read it, that's all right.
Well, that's perhaps wrong to say he doesn't read and write. He can write and he reads the newspaper.
Well, as a matter of fact, I can understand it very well. It says Constantinople, K-I-N-S-T-A-N-T-I-N-O-P-A-L. Constantinople in anybody's language.
I didn't write for you then.
Well, of course.
Now, who is right, you or I?
You are right, I am sure, Mrs. Papashvili.
But I think Mrs. Papashvili, I wonder if I pronounced that right. I think she's right in calling this a kind of folklore. But she's awfully young. She's only been selling books 20 years, and you're young, John, and Bennett's young. This may be like
This is Tales of Grandfather Gannett we're getting now.
Well, when I read this, I think we're going back to the good old times I grew up in when we all read Pollyanna and we read Mrs. Wiggs of the Cabbage Patch. And I think this book, Anything Can Happen, is just Mrs. Wiggs of the Cabbage Patch in a modern, up-to-date setting. That is, it isn't Mrs. Wiggs of the Cabbage Patch, it's Mrs. Wiggs of the Garlic Patch.
The food was much more highly flavored. I think you can say that safely.
John, I'd like to put in an objection to that, the last criticism of Lewis's. I think he forgets all about that wonderful, lusty old character whom we haven't mentioned yet this evening, Uncle Vano, of whom there was far too little in the book. Some of Uncle Vano's escapades would never go with Mrs. Wiggs of the Cabbage Patch. You may remember when he was 85 years old, he bought a gross of ladies' garters and had little bells put on them because he said make girls ting-ling-a-ling when they walk. Mrs. Wiggs never wore garters like that.
No, but Mrs. Wiggs would have loved it.
Mr. Gannett, I'd be curious to know what you don't believe in the book.
Well, I can tell you, Helen, I don't believe that when you started from Detroit for California, you got quite as far east as Youngstown. And then I'm a little bit dubious about the old man who remembered the buffalo racing across in front of his ranch in Nebraska when you met in 1932, if I've got to take the book literally. But you say I don't have to take it literally.
George, what about that business about Youngstown, Ohio?
I don't
Did you actually get as far east as Youngstown, Ohio from Detroit when you set out for California?
I get farther than that. I get in California.
Well, no, I mean... I think that answers the question sufficiently right there.
No.
Now we know.
No, what the idea is this. When we start out, there was I'm not supposed to read the map because I didn't know how to read it. So they tell me which way to go, and every time I was going, I was getting farther from California. Why? Because I was asking people, see? And so then I say, give me that map in here, and then I draw line from California and to where we was. Then I say, we got to follow this line. No matter what city we go on, I'm going now on my direction, not on yours.
I think that one of the things that is paramount in the book, Mr. Cerf brought up in mentioning the character of Vano, the old friend of George's, and that is the enormous warmth which you always find that the Georgians have not only for other Georgians, although it's particularly for other Georgians, but for all people. And I think that here on this broadcast tonight, we have gotten at least some indication of how broad that warmth is.
How many Georgians have you known?
Well, I haven't known any Georgians. I'm just going by George, which is almost enough for me at this point.
You know, George himself put in a warning in the book that we might remember in considering the book, and we might remember in future international relations. George himself says, remember that for Georgians, only too much is enough.
That's very apropos. Very apropos.
There's another bit of thing that George warns us about. I hope he'll never live up to whether he or Helen writes those words. When he says after this he's going to save his words and sell it to a dictionary. I hope he never sells his words to a dictionary. I like them better the way Helen writes them.
Several of the chapters in the book were concerned with George's difficulty in finding someone in America who spoke Georgian. It seems to be quite an obscure language. Can you speak some Georgian for us, George? I've never heard any Georgian. Be moderate in it. There may be a few Georgians listening.
Tuar is kartveli miaka.
Well, a little more.
That means I ask if any Georgians was here.
I thought he was talking to us and telling us what he really thought of us.
Think of the tumult if there had been a Georgian or two here.
I thought maybe he'd just... I thought he'd maybe just repeat that phrase he uses in the book, that the finest sight in life is to meet with the face of a friend in the land of the stranger.
That's a good line, too. Is that a translation from the Georgian, Miss Mrs. Papashvili?
Well, that would be, yes. I think, as a matter of fact, it's a Georgian phrase or a line of a poem. It's in a Georgian epic poem.
Several Georgian poets were mentioned during the course of the book. One thing that made the book particularly attractive to me, I must confess, were the long descriptions of the wonderful food, the shashlik, and the cooking with garlic, and the almost endless supplies of meat.
Particularly good these days.
Yes, it was really a wonderful thing. That wonderful scene where they went down onto the beach to cure the man who had the nervous broke down. So they went down to have a Georgian picnic, and they had picked a cove which had been used by bootleggers. And in the middle of the festivities, BB guns rang out, I believe they do, and some embattled farmers who wanted to clean up the bootlegging gang descended upon them. And, of course, then they just joined hands. The farmers brought some red wine. They were Italian, and the Georgians and the farmers went on. The description of the food was really superb.
There's one thing I might say further about not believing all of it. I've noticed sometimes people find that parts of it they think can't be true, or it's hard for them to believe, and that points out one thing which I felt when I wrote the book. Many of us who live rather ordinary American lives, or lives which are typically American.
Who does, Helen? Who does?
Well, a great many people do. Don't realize that there are among us a whole group of people who are living quite a different kind of life, side by side with us, which we know nothing about, and in very many instances don't try to find out anything about, or sometimes, if we do, are not pleased with it. And I think if we knew how many of our foreign-born have a different kind of a world than that we live in, it would help us to understand them. And perhaps some of the things in the book wouldn't be quite so strange or unbelievable.
But you know, Helen, some of us native-born have fun, too.
Well, it isn't a question of having fun. I think it's just a question of having it in a different way.
Ours is in a dull, native-born way.
I think what we need in this country is about 1 million more Georgians.
I agree with that, and since we have just about 30 seconds, I think that you might say farewell, George, in Georgian to close us off.
I'm sorry to have, we can't have 1.5 million Georgians because there's only 2 million in Georgia.
It's a wonderful sounding language, I can certainly say that for it.
There's the final signal, and time's up for both the author and the critic. Now we'd like to know what our listeners think. Do you or do you not intend to read Anything Can Happen by George and Helen Papashvili? That's spelled, by the way, Papashvili. Tell us in a short letter or postcard, 50 words or so, whether tonight's discussion has helped you make a choice. And to the writers of the 3 best entries, the Book of the Month Club will award full-year book subscriptions. Here's what those prizes include. A full-year subscription entitles you to every choice of the judges of the Book of the Month Club for the next 12 months, beginning with the February selection, The Thurbert Carnival by James Thurbert. In addition, winners will receive all the book dividends distributed by the club during the next year. Remember, we award 3 of these prizes every week. Address your entry to The Author Meets the Critics in care of station WHN, New York City. Winners for last week's program featuring The Secret History of the War by Waverly Root were Marion Reich, 45 Sunnyside Avenue, Brooklyn 7, New York, John Ritchie, 11 Leafy Lane, Larchmont, New York, and Roger R. Sikorsky, 609 Bloomfield Street, Hoboken, New Jersey. And now here's John McCaffrey to tell us about next week.
Next week's author of the evening will be Herbert Best, and the book under discussion will be Young'un, which some of our distinguished critics have reviewed with high praise. One of its principal backers has been Henry Seidel Canby, chairman of the editorial board of the Book of the Month Club and the Saturday Review of Literature. And Mr. Canby will be with us next week. We'll also have in the Critics' Corner, with a quite different view of Young'un, Harry Hansen of the New York World Telegram. If you'd like to see the broadcast, address your request for tickets to The Author Meets the Critics, care of this station. Before we close, our thanks go to George and Helen Papashvili for paying us a visit tonight, and thank you, Bennett Cerf and Louis Gannett, for joining in the fun. This is John McCaffrey saying good night for The Author Meets the Critics.
Your announcer is Clint Abler. This program comes to you from 1050 on your dial.